Thank you everyone for joining us today for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Mimi Lam and Drummond Munro, co-founders of Superette, where we will be discussing building a private cannabis company and the future of cannabis retail. Now, just a bit of a background history on Mimi and Drum. Mimi, as a co-founder of Superette for the last 2 years. Before that, she was the director of corporate development at Tokyo Smoke, which merged with Doja Cannabis and was later acquired by Cannabis Growth for $250 million. Prior to that, Mimi was an investment banker at Macquarie Group, where she spent 2 years. And also before that, she was an investment analyst for 1 year at Mistral Venture Partners. Her co-partner and co-founder of Superette is Drummond Munro. Before that, Drummond was also at Tokyo Smoke, where he was the head of real estate and retail development for 2 years. And prior to that was at Herschel Supply Company, where he was a manager of retail operations. And prior to that, at Kit and Ace as the director of retail. Everyone, please welcome Mimi and Drummond. Thanks for joining us. I would love to kick things off and learn about both your experiences and entry into the cannabis world. Why don't we start with you, Mimi?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having us. So cannabis has been a really, really interesting space and something that I've been eyeing on for a little bit longer than since I've actually been in the space. So like Matt said, I was in investment banking before cannabis, and let's be honest, I wasn't loving it there. Lifestyle wise, it wasn't doing it for me. I learned a lot, but I was actively looking to join something else. And because my previous experience was at Mistral Venture Partners, there I got to interact with a lot of startups. I was really interested on being on the operating side and really joining a young, small, growing company. And as I was doing my research and in my way out of banking, I started looking at the cannabis space, and my now fiance, then boyfriend, was already in the cannabis industry. And so learning a little bit from him, I was starting to use as a medical patient and really learning about how I could use cannabis for myself. And then essentially what happened was 2017, there were a whole bunch of 420 parties across the city of Toronto with a lot of startups here. And in my research, there were a lot of companies that were focused on cultivation, specifically for medical purposes. And I met this company called Tokyo Smoke at their 420 party that year. And that was the first real company that I had met that was focusing on building a customer brand and building a relationship in what they believe to be a CPG good down the road after legalization. And so from that party onwards, I met the early members of that team, really was fascinated by the entire industry in that company, and essentially got them to hire me, and that was my entry into the space.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's definitely how I got into the space, through Tokyo Smoke. But Drum, I'd love to hear your entry into the space prior to cannabis.
I mean, you were a part of my entry into the space. I don't know if you remember that.
I think I do, but why don't you tell the audience?
Yeah, so Cohen and I were involved in a company called Turnstile. I know Devin was on here a couple weeks ago speaking, but essentially Turnstile got acquired by Yelp, and we were celebrating one weekend, and Matt was telling me about Tokyo Smoke. And, you know, this is at the time where the only people in the cannabis space were people like Canopy, Aurora. They were very focused on cultivation. You know, I guess Tokyo Smoke's thesis was, as maybe you already mentioned, at the end of the day, cannabis will become a consumer packaged good, and therefore brands and the retail are going to be what ultimately the consumer decides to choose. And so my background is quite a bit different. I've been in retail for the last 8 years, and after chatting with Cohen, I got connected to Alan, who had founded Tokyo Smoke, and he essentially offered me a job while I was at Herschel, and I moved back a couple months later to help build out the retail program, and that's where I met Mimi, and we started 1 day apart. So
wow. Well, I'm glad to be a part of your beginning journeys into cannabis and the future of it. So, I mean, that is what we're here to talk about today, which is Superette, and an amazing company that you guys co-founded after finishing off your tenure at Tokyo Smoke. I would love to hear what the original idea was for Superette and how did it evolve into its current state?
Yeah, I mean, the journey of Superette has changed so much over the last few years. And even before Superette began, there was a lot of activity in the cannabis space. And so while Drum and I were at Tokyo Smoke, we saw a lot of these companies start doing their thing in this industry. And we saw a lot of things that worked and a lot of things that didn't work. And we saw how companies operated across different places in Canada, places like BC or Alberta. And so Drum and I both left Canopy to focus on something for ourselves in this space. And if you looked across the entire cannabis value chain, everything from cultivation all the way to packaging and branding, we felt really strongly about retail. Retail is the place where you hold the entire interaction with the customer. You get to capture both the economics and the brand of what we are trying to express. And so we knew that we wanted to do something in retail. And so looking at retail specifically, again, looking at what has worked and what hasn't worked. And one of Drum's strengths is real estate. And Ontario at that time was going through a bit of a shift from a public model to a private model. And we knew that real estate was going to be really important. And with that strength in mind, we knew that we were able to have a leg up on securing really, really great spots for the store. And from a brand perspective, we wanted to make sure that whatever we brought into this market was something that was friendly and approachable and thoughtful. And so, whereas a lot of the companies that, in Canada and in the US as well, saw cannabis as being very, scary, regulated, and what ended up were clinical spaces. There were spots that did not feel accessible. Everything was behind a glass box. And retail is really the last point where you can touch the customer from a brand perspective. And so we wanted to bring the feeling of that corner store, to cannabis. And we started with that one thought in mind. And, obviously our journey has changed since then, but we've been able to grow quite a bit over the last year and 2 years now, almost.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, it was sort of, we didn't believe that the standards had been set for retail. This industry is 2 years old, and to say this is exactly how it's going to be, these are the industry players, the bar has been set, just wasn't true. And so, I think we're going to talk about this later on, but part of the reason we started Superette is the whole cannabis retail industry is incredibly homogenous. You kind of fall into two buckets. It's you're either trying to be the Apple store or you're trying to be the legacy store. And for us, there's so much room in between. And coming from a traditional retail background is sort of, cannabis is CPG, it is retail at the end of the day, and why aren't people applying really basic retail principles to Superette? And so for us, it was sort of we can do retail better or different, and both ways hadn't really been done at this point. And so we were just looking to do something for ourselves.
And we just felt that, there are a lot of things in cannabis retail that people just took for granted as being the standard. And whether it be things like sensory experience through ScentPod or, having iPads as the only menu interface for customers, people just took that as status quo and never really questioned. They were just like, oh, if I open up a store, this is what it must be. Yeah. And so we actually took the time to be like, well, why don't we actually look at these elements differently? What is our spin and our take? And how do we actually make this a little bit different from what has been done over the last few years and frankly over the last few decades in this industry?
Yeah, and you guys really brought the human element into the experience, where you didn't try to separate sort of the picking of the product from the checkout. It's all integrated into one. You have the two baskets, the green and the red. Red, need some help, green, leave me alone. Or people just want to talk to people and understand what this whole concept of retail and cannabis is about, and you really bring it to the forefront for them. If you look at some of the pictures from your stores, it seems like it's a mixture of a bakery, a convenience store, and a bit of a deli. How did you guys get inspired by those elements to bring it into the cannabis experience?
Yeah, a lot of our peers in this space were looking towards, the Apple Store or the MedMens of the world, or Starbucks. And what we wanted to emulate were more of your local community diner or deli or convenience store. And we drew a lot of those elements into our visual identity and how we created the space from a visual standpoint. And from it's funny that you mentioned the baskets. I feel like we do get a lot of attention for that. But really what it does, it sets the tone for the customer. As soon as you walk into our Ottawa store, it sets the tone that you have agency over what you want to do or what you don't want to do. And that's really important because cannabis, we're very comfortable with it because we're in this industry. We've been talking about it day in, day out for years. But the reality is a large part of this population, still aren't there yet, and it'll take a long time for them to be there. So to get them to a place that is comfortable, they need to feel like they're in control of what their journey with cannabis looks like. And it starts from as soon as you walk into that door, and that's important to us.
Yeah, and I mean the fact that you can distinguish parts of the store being like, that looks like a bakery, that looks like a deli, that reminds me of a diner, is the fact that you've already seen it before. And for people who are looking to get into cannabis or aren't quite sure about how to go about it, it's like, this feels innately familiar. It feels approachable. I already feel at ease. I've experienced this part before. And so that was really important for us because, as we mentioned before, coming from the medical background, it evolved to be very clinical. You get your ID check, you're passed to a bud tender who cashes you out and essentially escorts you out the door. In any other retail environment, you have the autonomy and the agency to go anywhere in the store you want, to pick up whatever product you want. And we wanted to bring that back to cannabis retail.
Right. It feels like, at Starbucks, it's like an assembly line. You get in, get out, and just act like a robot when you come in. But at Superette, it absolutely is not. You have the freedom to do what you want, be approachable or not approachable. It's really welcoming. So, I mean, that's interesting to hear about how you wanted to differentiate yourself at the retail level. But can you tell us a bit more about how you were trying to differentiate yourself from the brand and awareness level in such a crowded space beyond just a physical retail concept?
Yeah, that's a great question because I feel like everyone likes to talk about the visual elements. That's the easiest thing to talk about. And so, we tried to do some kind of internal exercise that said, what are we known for as Superette? And a lot of people do end up with the result of, Superette is the store that looks like a deli. But the reality is, if you actually walk into Superette, it's different. It's not just the visual elements of it, it's the entire vibe that you get in. And there's so many different factors to that. There's the natural light that comes into the store. That's a product of how we design the space and how we covered up the windows or didn't cover them up, to more importantly, the interaction that you get with bud tenders. Like you mentioned before, the human connection. That's something that we prioritize extremely, extremely high in terms of our in-store experience. And so we put a lot of emphasis to who we hire, how we train them, what does that interaction looks like, so that when you leave the space, you can talk about, us as being the store that looks like a deli, but what you actually take away is the feeling that you got in the store.
Yeah, and it's a unique environment in the sense that what other retail store besides liquor does everyone have access to the exact same product? You can't differentiate based on your buy. You can, but you're given the exact same buy sheet as anyone else in the space. And it's really how you differentiate from the customer experience standpoint, the aesthetics, and your overall visual identity and how you connect with the consumers. So to stand out, you need to do something different because the reality is it's just going to become the same experience time and time again. Yeah,
you can tell that when you go into like the US liquor industry, all the different retail outlets for liquor, they all look very different because they're allowed to be, where in Canada it's very controlled. It seems like you took that approach from like the US market. It's like, hey, we're going to sell you everything everyone else is selling you, but it's going to feel a lot different when you come here, and you're going to want to keep coming back and having that experience with our bud tenders who know what they're talking about, or just the seeing of new items on the shelf and how they're displayed differently than just walking into a very, factory-oriented robotic experience like the LCBO or something.
For us, it was that because it's a brand new industry, we felt like we were one of the few companies that actually built a retail brand with retail professionals. It was sort of like after cultivation, retail became the sexy new thing. Everyone was trying to get into it. They thought it was the next green rush, but everyone just made assumptions on how retail should fit instead of actually learning what the customers want and how to create an environment that's most appealing to them.
And I would say an element to that is, it is a regulated space. And so people weren't willing to take those risks. And so we, at every opportunity we have, we try to push those boundaries, and whether that be in store or also digitally as well. And so we think about how we do our marketing. A lot of it has to do with connecting with our community directly. And people aren't either, haven't really thought about that or aren't willing to take the risk. And so we're here kind of putting up our hands and trying everything we want.
Yeah, that's really smart. I mean, you guys definitely set out on a very big mission with a couple setbacks in the early days. How did you stay on that focused mission with that sort of government rollout that kind of was botched?
I mean, it's funny because you say setback, but I would just say it was a change in the industry. And anyone who is involved with the cannabis industry know that is constantly changing. And so we're dealing with that every single day, every single month. It just is what it is. And so if you are afraid of change, then this might not be the industry for you. And so, yeah, we've had to pivot pretty quickly. And so for people who aren't familiar with our story, we started Superette when it was a fully private model. Anyone could have up to 75 licenses. There were no kind of global cap on these licenses. And then a few months after we made that decision, the government decided to shut down the number of licenses and said that there's only going to be 25 across the entire province, so that they could really test out and make sure there's enough supply for each store, and so that the people who were operating could be successful as a learning ground for what the industry could be like. And then a few months after that, it went from 25 licenses to 50 to now where we are now is anyone can essentially apply for a license as an operator and open up stores. And so over the last 2 years of all these changes, we've had to move really, really quickly. Every single day we question, what is it that we're doing? Are we doing it the right way? And the great thing is Drum and I have very different opinions on basically everything. We talk things through. We've built a really strong team that are not afraid to voice their opinions and their perspectives. And rather than, having a team of yes people, we're able to talk these things through. And so even like earlier this year, we see what's happened with things like COVID-19 and the changes in the regulations through there. It's just another day, to be perfectly honest. And, we're flexible, but that also keeps things pretty fun.
Yeah, and that's a mindset that you two have that a lot of people who wanted to get in and get out of the space probably weren't willing to actually think about. It's interesting to hear you say that, because when I remember talking to you about, all these changes coming from the government, investors were panicking because they never thought this could happen, but you guys were so calm and collected, and maybe you were just showing that to the investors, but you really did sort of take a deep breath, sit back and think about the best plan of action. Even though it was going to take a lot more work than people had originally anticipated, you did see the light at the other end of the tunnel, and thank God you did, because you saw through it, where a lot of people just said, you know what, forget it. All those LOIs we had on real estate spaces, just forget it. We'll move on to another investment category. The tourist capital left, which created another great void and opportunity for you to stay focused on that mission, probably because you also had experience in seeing how things were changing in 2017 and 18 with Tokyo Smoke and the regional changes there. So, that's incredible to hear. But you just talked about this, Mimi, with, your team and how you bring everyone together. You have this collaboration, this radical transparency and democracy in your organization. How are you able to build that culture and also recruit people who are not necessarily interested in looking at working in the cannabis space?
Yeah, that's so critical. And I feel like Drum hears me say this like every other week, but your company and your brand is only as good or as strong as the people that you have in working with you. And so that was a huge priority for us and is a huge priority for us. And I would say it starts from the top down. Like both Drum and I have very minimal ego. We're the first ones to kind of raise our hand and say, like, we don't actually know what we're doing. And we're very open to suggestions and change and making sure that we have that diversity of thought and that we can include them in our decision-making process. This is not a dictatorship. We don't, make all the decisions between the two of us. The people that we bring on board, we want to make sure that we are their support staff, essentially. We're here to make sure that they can do the best that they can in their capacity, and so they can be creative and successful in their own way. And I think a lot of that has, created a culture that includes things like, the Enneagram test and making sure that we have a good understanding of who we are as people and how we work together as a team. Well, what we've also been able to do is reach out and, externally showcase to people who are not in our team that we are actually living and breathing what we say. I think a lot of problems that companies have is it's easy to say nice sounding words, but it's not enough. And I think if anyone interacted with anyone at Superette, they would know that we are actually living by our values.
It's interesting, and coming back to the point of hiring people who came from retail to begin with, is a lot of these companies that I worked for had such a strong emphasis on culture to begin with. So you're talking about Lululemon at Sage, and it's not that we're doing anything completely innovative. It's just we're making sure this is a foundational part of our DNA from the get-go. And we've been able to learn so much by bringing people in and saying, hey, this is what we used to do at our old company. I think this would be really great. And it's not something like our way or the highway. It's integrating all these different pieces and all these elements that come from each recruit.
Yeah, that definitely rings true with the people you have on your team, even when I interact with them. How would you define the culture, Mimi and Drum, in terms of you had explained it to a total new person to Superette?
I'd say fun. We like to have a lot of fun.
Like autonomy. I mean,
yeah.
No one's trying to micromanage. If we've hired you, it's because we believe in your skill set. And, I'm always, everyone says this, but you should hire smarter people. And I truly believe that's what we do here. Yeah,
well, it's absolutely worked. I mean, you guys were top winners at the Canadian Cannabis Awards in 2019. You won the top retail store. You won the top budtender award. You won the Women in Weed Trailblazer Award, Mimi. Startup of the Year, and Brand Finalist of the Year. So obviously it is working. The team you put together is stellar. But let's move on to the next topic here, which is resisting the urge to go public. And I know this is something that a lot of people talk about with companies like yours and how you have all this momentum. You got to go public. You got to take this thing to the public market and let the retail investors get a piece of it. How has staying a private cannabis company benefited you during the recent downturn in the market?
Yeah, I mean, the public-private debate is always something that startups have to go through. And there's honestly, there's pros and cons to both ways. And, a lot of people do chase the go public market, for access to capital, to give their existing shareholders or founders liquidity. There's a lot of pros to going public. For us, staying private has been a huge blessing. We've been able to make decisions on our own without kind of the public pressures that our peers who might be publicly traded are facing. And that's allowed us to make a lot of bets that might not result in next quarter results, but is actually going to be foundational to the growth of our company. And so that was really important to us, that if we were going to build it, we were actually going to build it. And I think the problem that a lot of companies end up facing is going public too early. If they haven't reached a certain scale, if they haven't reached a certain level of growth that is sustainable in the public markets, you don't want to be stuck with a story that, yes, has traded public, but then automatically gets dumped by, investors don't actually support what they're doing. And so, that's a continuous question that we have. But I would say even over the last 6 to 12 months and what's happened with the world, it's been a huge blessing to be private.
Yeah, absolutely. And you both have amazing experience in being private for a bit and also seeing what it's like on the public side when Tokyo Smoke eventually went public with the Doja merger and then the Cannabis acquisition. And then Mimi, when you were an investment banker, you probably also saw how much work it was to maintain that public profile. So you don't have to sell me on it, but I totally agree. It's probably helped you guys move through this market downturn as a private company. So I'd love to move into, you guys are trailblazers in this industry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the cannabis industry today and where do you see it heading in the next few years?
That's a fascinating question. I think the cannabis market today, if I had to sum up in one word, would be messy. I think there's been a lot of learnings over the last few years, but it's only getting started. And so we've interacted with many companies who were trying to get too big without kind of the right bones to grow the company, the wrong emphasis on how to grow, not just as a company, but as an industry. And we're seeing the ramifications of that. We're seeing a lot of people descaling. We're seeing a lot of layoffs, a lot of sale of assets. But that's the result of what has happened over the last 12 to 24 months and even previous to that. And so I would imagine that we're going to see a lot more focus, a more dedicated focus on exactly what you're doing, what you're trying to bring into this world. And I think one thing that's really exciting for me is a more focus on intellectual property and data. Everyone talks about, hard assets, building capacity, but I think the value's in IP and data. Because that is what's going to help on the global playing field. And that's going to be what crosses border. And that is what's going to hold, be the moat for a company in the eyes of customers.
I mean, to piggyback off Mimi, she said everything that I'm thinking, but it's a hyper-focused value propositions. Everyone was trying to do too much, too fast. And as a result, we've all seen what's happened to the public markets, selling off assets. And for us, it's just staying focused on what we're doing and making sure we can maintain that growth.
Yeah, it comes back to being private too, allowing you to stay focused, not feel external pressures as well. I've always said that, if you had sort of the efficiency of the tech startup and sort of the financial due diligence of a real estate investor, mixed together into a cannabis company, you'd have a really good cannabis company because you wouldn't be spraying and praying into all these different things. You have to be very capital efficient, and you'd focus on cash flow as well, which seems to be what you guys have been focusing on a lot, which is amazing. And I know, publicly you've said how much, revenue you've been able to generate from one store. What's the future look like for Superette over the next, year or two, and where do you think it goes from there?
Yeah, for the people who've been following our story, we've been working diligently to grow our retail presence. And so we're going from 1 store to 5 over the next few months. The first one in Toronto is actually going to open over the next few weeks. So we're really excited for that. We're also really excited to grow the brand. We've always, looked at Superette as more than just retail. We want to bring that brand outside of just the physical space, and how that translates, digitally, how that translates on products. Those are all things that we're working on. And, to your point, in terms of, the financial diligence and the elements of what a tech startup would bring and a real estate investment firm would bring, I think it's easy, again, for people to look at, what is visual. But ultimately, what's important in a company is the structure and the foundation. And so a lot of the success in Superette has been built on things like, having financial controls, understanding legal and corporate structure, having good corporate governance. Those are things that, a lot of startups have historically generally struggle with because they just don't know. But with experience that Drum and I have, we've been able to leapfrog a lot of those potential mistakes, and that's allowed us to build a really strong foundation for this growth.
Yeah, absolutely. As an early first investor, I can definitely say you report better than some public companies do with your financials and monthly and quarterly updates. So, I totally agree with that. I also was able to get a bit of a sneak peek of the new store opening up in downtown Toronto on Yonge Street, and it looks fantastic. The natural light you guys have coming in from the west side is beautiful, and I can't wait to see it. I will say, though, I don't have enough Superette branded clothing items in my closet. So if I can get a little bit more before they sell out off the shelves in the first week, I'd really appreciate that.
It's a hot commodity.
Of course, man.
All right. Well, I'd love to move on to one of my favorite sections, which is the book recommendations. So Mimi, you have 2 books here, and Drum, you have 2 books. Why don't we start with you, Mimi, and what your 2 top book recommendations are?
Yeah, my 2 books for the people who don't have the slide in front of them. One is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, and the other one is called Sapiens. Shoe Dog is just like a fascinating inside look into Nike. That is a household name that people are very familiar with, but don't necessarily understand the story behind it. And so it's just fascinating to kind of read through the history of that company and that brand and how it came to be, what it is today. And so that's been, a bit of an inspiration for me as an entrepreneur and building something kind of from scratch now. And Sapiens is just like a very fascinating look at humankind and, the history of us as a species. So I know there's a few books following this. It's on my list, but that's been a recent read that has really stuck out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read Sapiens, and it makes you take like 100,000-foot view of your own life versus like every day just trying to figure out how to get through it. It's really interesting.
Have you read all of these? I feel like
I've read a couple, but I'll let you know.
So my 2 books are How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which is essentially highlighting the renaissance of psychedelics in the mental health field. And if anyone's read Michael Pollan before, he used to be a food author. He's an amazing writer, and it's a lot of like firsthand experiences. And I find this industry fascinating, as I'm sure a lot of people do. I think, cannabis was the last couple of years. We're really going to see the boom of psychedelics in this space. And then the other one's called Originals, How Nonconformists Change the World. And it's essentially firsthand accounts of entrepreneurs and people who think differently. And so fascinating examples, especially as an entrepreneur building a business, and how you can take a different perspective on things.
Yeah, both 2 very fascinating books. And I agree. I think the psychedelics movement will be pretty strong over the next couple of years. Has the itch gotten into the Superette culture at all in terms of thinking about it? Or not right now, obviously, right? Focused only on cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest problems that any entrepreneur has is, potentially being too distracted by things that are not within their wheelhouse. And so, that's definitely an interesting area. And so we're looking from the sidelines, but not making any immediate steps because, the fear is that the crash and burn that we're seeing in cannabis is also going to happen in the psychedelic space. We're seeing a lot of people looking at, mushrooms, LSD, psychedelics in general, with a similar lens with cannabis 2-3 years ago. And so we're in wait and see mode, but, personally, it's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it moves on to our final part. So I always love to ask our guests for any final words of inspiration for the audience. Why don't we start with you, Drum?
I know we were just talking about this. I mean, I think words of advice would be, obviously you've highlighted that we've had to be incredibly flexible in this industry, but I would say stick to your vision. I mean, that's the only thing you can do if you really want to build a company the way you want to build a company. Commit to that.
And just to dovetail off that, my words would be have a vision, but focus on execution as well. I think it's easy to have ideas, but how that shows up in the real world and how do you build a team around that? How do you build a company around that? That's, step 2. So keep to your vision and then make sure that you can actually bring it to life.
Yeah, well, you both definitely embody sticking to your focus and your vision and being so disciplined while building an amazing culture and team around you at Superette. So thank you very much for joining us on today's Tank Talk episode.
Thanks, Matt.